In the 10 minutes or so that I have here, I hope to show you that, number one, it's not the magnitude of the debt that is the problem, but rather it's the fact that it compounds at interest. If we were to replace compound interest with simple interest, the debt problem will resolve itself over time. Further, compound interest concentrates wealth in the hands of lenders. Since the poor are not lenders, their wealth as a percentage of the total wealth of the nation shrinks when their government borrows at compound interest. And finally, the old term that was used for compound interest is usury. The Catholic Church has always condemned usury as immoral, and it has considered such contracts as null and void. The borrower is not morally obligated to pay compound interest. Therefore, all governments of the developed world are morally free to do away with paying compound interest and solve their national debt problems. Such a solution has the least economic impact of all possible solutions to the debt problem. It avoids hyperinflation, it avoids a massive recession, it avoids rioting in the streets. Let us now understand why compound interest is immoral. If you had borrowed 1 penny, just 1 penny, at the time of Christ at 6% interest, how much do you think you would owe today, 2,000 years later? The answer is 4.09 times 10 to the power of $48. And that's way more money than there is in the entire world. To put that in perspective, if there were 10 billion people on the earth, each earning $1 billion a second, for every second from the beginning of time, 15 billion years ago, their combined earnings would only amount to 4.7 times 10 to the 36th. You would need another 864 billion Earths, each full with 10 billion people earning $1 billion a second from the beginning of time before you would come close to having the amount of money needed to pay back the interest due on a measly 1 penny loan at a low 6% interest for a mere 2,000 years. I'm sure that most of you do not believe me. You can take out your calculator and do the math yourself. A measly 1 penny debt, if it compounds long enough, is impossible to pay. It's not the magnitude of the debt that matters, it's the fact that it compounds. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to lose his very soul? Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. The only way you can gain the whole world is through compound interest. Now, let's replace compound interest with simple interest. If you had borrowed 1 penny at the time of Christ at a 6% simple interest, where by definition, simple interest is paid only on the principal borrowed and not on accrued interest or fees, you would owe 6/100ths of a penny each year for 2,000 years, for a total of $1.20 in total interest. So there's a radical difference between simple interest and compound interest. Conceptually speaking, most people understand that there's something wrong with a scenario where someone borrows just 1 penny and ends up owing more than the wealth of the entire world, no matter how long he borrowed the money. This fact alone ought to be sufficient to convince most people of the immorality of compound interest and hence the morality of altering government debt contracts. Now let's use the existing public debt and show the difference between compound interest and simple interest going forward. The U.S. government has roughly $15 trillion in debt, and over the past decade, its average interest was about 5% per year compounded. So that means that over a 50-year period beginning today, the existing debt alone, assuming no new debt but no payments made on the current debt, will grow to about $172 trillion. For the American people to have the same ability to pay off that debt 50 years from now as we do with the current debt now, then the economy also roughly $15 trillion in size, will have to grow at about 5% a year. Now that's either 5% real growth and zero inflation, or 5% inflation and zero growth, or somewhere in between, say 3% growth and 2% inflation. But if the government were to pay simple interest instead of compound interest, its existing debt alone, again, assuming no new debt, but no payments made on the current debt, and assuming the same interest rate of 5%, but this time simple interest, it will grow to $52.5 trillion, or less than a third of what it would be if compounded. And if the economy were to grow at a 3% rate, which has been the average for the last 100 years, with a 2% inflation on top of that, then the size of the American economy will grow from its current $15 trillion to $172 trillion, reducing the debt to just 30% of GDP. All this is done without raising any taxes or reducing any spending. This is the miracle of compounding. Now further, compound interest guarantees inflation. If we do not replace compound interest with simple interest, government debt becomes more and more impossible to pay over time. And this is true because borrowing rates typically exceed the growth rate of the economy. Borrowing rates in the past decade have averaged around 5%. Growth rates actually in the last decade have averaged less than 3%, but historically around 3%. If you're borrowing at 5 and you're growing at 3, it's going to be more and more difficult to pay it back. So the only way the government can repay compound interest is by reducing the value of the currency, and that occurs when it prints money, as it is doing right now with QE2. Compound inflation is needed to keep up with compound interest. This point is important. Compound interest is the root cause of inflation. And compound interest, not the magnitude of the debt, is the underlying cause of people's fear today of hyperinflation. Further, compound interest concentrates wealth. Again, governments typically borrow at interest rates that exceed the growth rate of the economy. So if you do not inflate the currency by at least the difference between the average borrowing rates and the average growth rates, wealth will concentrate in the hands of the lenders, i.e. the rich. Using the above numbers, lenders' wealth will grow at 5%, but the average person's wealth, as represented by the economy, grows at 3%. Actually, it's a little less than 3% because you have to subtract the population growth from that. So government borrowing at compound interest over time is mathematically guaranteed to either cause inflation, concentrate wealth, or both. Lastly, paying off the debt via austerity is mathematically impossible. Austerity, by definition, means the government does not print money to pay off its debt. Rather, it seeks to raise enough via taxes or cut enough spending to get its debt under control. Raising taxes reduces the size of its GDP because people have less to spend, and cutting spending also reduces GDP. Yet, its debt continues to grow at 5% each year. Worse, the interest rate at which the debt compounds goes higher and higher, the less likely it is that the government will pay it back. Look at Greece, for example. If the government is cutting spending and or raising taxes and you refuse to allow the Fed to print money, then theoretically, the only way such an economy could pay off its debt is if its entire economy were to grow through exports at a faster rate than the growth rate of its debt. If, as in the case of Greece, it has no control over the value of its currency, the only way it can massively increase exports is if its labor costs were to completely collapse. The end result will be slave wages, where any surplus above that would be used to pay off its masters, the debt owners. Even in such an extreme, it's not clear that export growth would be sufficient. So in conclusion, it is morally illicit for governments to stop paying compound interest because it was immoral for them to engage in such contracts in the first place. Moreover, I would argue that it's immoral for them to continue to pay it. It's unethical for governments to ask the poor and the middle class to tighten their belts so that wealth can be concentrated further in the hands of the rich lenders, or for that matter, the Chinese or whoever other foreign entity happens to be lending the money through an immoral usury contract. Replacing compound interest with an annual late fee, or what's the effective equivalent of simple interest, resolves much of the current debt problem, and it does so with the least economic impact as compared to the alternatives of hyperinflation or radical defaulting. Thank you.